Welcome everyone to today's Jewish Gen Talk with Nolan Altman. We are glad that you were with us. As we always do, please post in the chat where you are signing in from. We have people registered from around the world. Please let us know where you're from. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes, but it's always so wonderful to see where everybody is around the world. We have Susan from Los Angeles, Gary from Jerusalem, Tina Laurie from Fayetteville, New York, June Entman from St. Augustine, Florida. We have Ottawa, Canada, Sarah Fisher from Sherman, Connecticut, Glasgow, Yerushalayim, Ray from Denver, Duluth, Minnesota. Welcome everyone who's logging in to today's Jewish Gen Talk with Nolan Altman. We're glad that you're here. We will get started soon. In the meantime, please let us know where you are signing in from. Post this note in the chat. It's always so wonderful to see you. We have Connie Fisher, Corona, California, Silver Spring. We have Joy from Bellevue. We have someone from Germany. Sue Smith from London. Carol Barrett from sunny Solana Beach in California. We have Keenan from Tel Aviv. Welcome to you. Someone from Shaker Heights. Dan Rottenberg, welcome from Philadelphia. Have Anne from Seattle, Marion from Santa Barbara in California, with Boca Raton. We have Essex in the United Kingdom. We have people from around the world. We have Robin from Jerusalem. We have Ron Doctor from Portland, Oregon. Ron, welcome. So glad to see you. A volunteer of Jewish Gens. Gary Friedman from Toronto. Rob Koludner from Columbia, Maryland. Sarah Lehman from Jerusalem, Danny Freeman from Berkshire in England, Phyllis Levine from La Jolla in California, Arlene Siegel from North Carolina. Okay, we are going to get started, everyone. We are so glad that you are with us today. I'd like to welcome you all to today's Jewish Gen Talk with Nolan Altman on patronymic naming and the genealogical value of Jewish cemetery research. My name is Avram Grohl, and I am privileged to oversee Jewish Gen, which is the Jewish Genealogical Research Division of the Museum of Jewish Heritage Living Memorial to the Holocaust. The museum is located in downtown New York City. If you can imagine the Statue of Liberty, we are right across the water. If you have been here, then you know what an important institution this is. And if you have not, I encourage you to please visit. And when you do, you can either come back or for the first time, please let me know. You can reach out to me, email me at agroll@JewishGen.org. It would be wonderful to greet you personally and to show you around. A couple of notes, as always, before we get started. Nolan has been gracious enough to be willing to take questions at the end of the program. So you can post questions as we go along or at the end in the Q&A on the bottom of the screen. Please do not use the chat for the questions. It should only be put in the Q&A. Please keep the questions as general in nature as possible. We won't be able to answer very specific questions. You can use the chat during the program to connect with each other, to share advice, to make comments, but please use the Q&A for the actual questions that you have for Nolan. This session is being recorded. It will go up on our YouTube channel following the program, usually later this afternoon. You can, we'll send out an email when the recording is live, and of course, please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can be notified anytime we do add a new video. And of course, if you're not, please make sure that you're subscribed to the discussion group and that you are on the Jewish Genealogy portal on Facebook and that you like the Jewish Gen page on Facebook so that you can stay informed of not only new videos, but everything that is going on at Jewish Gen, and of course, so that you can connect with the broader Jewish genealogical community. I'd also like to welcome all the volunteers who are on this call today, who are on this webinar today, specifically volunteers of Nolan's projects of the Holocaust database and Jobar and the Memorial Plaques database. So we welcome all of you. We are glad that you're here. A little bit about Nolan Altman, someone who really needs no introduction in the Jewish genealogical community. But Nolan was bit by the genealogy bug when he was inspired to write his family history in 1996 in memory of his mother. He has presented his How to Document and Research Your Family History seminar to university Holocaust history classes and numerous adult and continuing education classes. He has made presentations and computer workshops at numerous IAJGS conferences on Jewish genealogy worldwide, and I will take a moment just to give a plug. The IAJGS is the umbrella organization for Jewish genealogical societies around the world, and they are running a conference this summer in London, which is a summer camp for Jewish genealogists, is how it's been described. It's an incredible opportunity to come together, to network, to be in the same room as others who share the same interests that you do, and ultimately to learn from experts and how to further advance your research and to learn about your Jewish family history and heritage. You can learn about it at iajgs.org. There's a link to the conference website, and I hope that you will all join us at the IAJGS conference this summer. Nolan has published numerous articles in various journals. He coordinates our burial registry called Jobar. He coordinates our Holocaust database, and he coordinates our memorial plaques database. So he is incredibly involved in JewishGen. He's also part of our senior leadership team. He's been very much involved in helping us in terms of strategic planning and just general advice for me professionally and personally. He was a past president and treasurer and current board member of the JGS of Long Island and a member of the JGS of New York. In 2021, Mr. Altman was awarded the IAJGS Lifetime Achievement Award for his continuing efforts to promote, volunteer, and advocate for Jewish genealogical research. He resides in Oceanside, New York. And just on a personal note, he is someone who not only brings exceptional expertise to everything he does and to all of his work at JewishGen, and he is a subject matter expert, but he is someone who has completely devoted himself and dedicated himself to JewishGen for many, many years, and also makes himself available to anybody in need, particularly me, whenever I call, whenever I ask for advice, whenever I ask for how should we approach a problem. He is always willing and able to offer his advice, and usually when I take it, it's successful, and if I don't, then that's on me. So we are truly fortunate to have Nolan as part of our JewishGen team, and I'm truly fortunate to be able to call him a colleague. So Nolan, thank you very much for being here, and without any further ado, Nolan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Avrami. Thank you very much for that introduction. And as you know, now my name is Nolan, and I'm a genealogist. And I guess when I started out many moons ago, just like you, I probably started out with an oral history, and my little family unit is all the way to the right on this chart. And so when I talked to my father, who was the only one of his siblings born in the United States, and I said to him, can you tell me about your parents? He could do that because he was born here. And then I said, tell me something about the Altman grandparents. And he knew nothing about them. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange, but you know, maybe because he was born here, he was a boy, he never asked the questions or whatever. I went to my aunt, who was born in Poland, and I said, can you tell me something about the Altman grandparents? And again, she knew nothing. And all of a sudden, now I'm stuck with one of these brick walls that you hear about all the time, that you don't know how to get past, where you have some documentation, until I got into naming practices. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you back to grade school, or whenever you learned about the explorers to North America. And I want to take you back to the explorer Eric the Red, right? Eric the Red founded Greenland. Eric had a son whose name was Leif, but he was known as Leif Erikson. Leif had a son named Thorkel, and Thorkel was known as Thorkel Leifson. Notice what's happening here. The children are being named after the father. There's no family name being handed down from generation to generation. These are patronymic names. And why is this important to us? Because they link together generations. And for genealogical purposes, this is an excellent way of looking at generation after generation. Well, the reason why this is important to us is because our Hebrew names are patronymic names. My Hebrew name is Noach ben Munish. My father's Hebrew name was Munish ben Noach. His father, or my grandfather's name, was Noach ben Munish. Well, there are a couple of things here that we should see. First of all, where I couldn't go back any further than my grandfather, if I know that my grandfather's Hebrew name is Noach ben Munish, I just told you my great-grandfather's name was Munish. And so this is what I needed in order to break through that brick wall and go back another generation. Also, you see these names keep repeating in families, and that's not unusual. In fact, my father, whose English name is Morris, has 4 first cousins with the name Morris. And I thought, this is the most uncreative family. Couldn't they come up with any other names? And the reason why every branch has a Morris, except for one, is because all of these Morrises or Moonishes were named after the person that they were named for had passed away. We are Ashkenazic, and the naming custom, not rule, but custom, is naming in memory of someone who's passed away, where Sephardic may name in honor of somebody who's living. And so the one oldest branch in my family tree doesn't have a Morris or a Moonish. And why is that? Because that Moonish was still alive. And so just seeing the names repeating in a family tree as you look amongst all the branches may also help you determine when somebody lived and when somebody died. But all in all, what we're doing is we're still linking together generations by looking at these patronymic names. And so if we take a look at a Hebrew patronymic name, and I'll start at the right as if it was in Hebrew, first you have a given name, and it could be given name and middle name, so it could be more than one. Then a designation as to whether you are the son of or the daughter of the father's name. And if your family is a descendant from the priestly tribe of Levi, or if more specifically, if you are a descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother, the first high priest, the first Kohen Gadol, at the end of your name, you'll have an appended Ha-Levi or Ha-Kohen. So if we take my name, which I've spelled here in Hebrew letters, Noach, or then transliterated into Latin letters, and then my name as it is, and there is no translation, by the way, between a Hebrew name and an English name. Noach could just as easily have been Nathan or Norman or Norbert or whatever my parents wanted to name me. Then you get the son of Ben. The father's name is Munish. And if I was a Cohen, it would say HaKohen at the end. And my name would be Noach ben Munish HaKohen. Okay, and I'm not a Kohen, so just to make that clear. But the most unusual name, to show you as an example how this works, is Aaron, the first Kohen Gadol. So again, just setting it up, you've got his first name, Aharon. He is the son of his father's name is Amram. But here we have a very unusual case, because Aaron was a Kohen and yet his father was not. And so typically, if you're a Kohen, the way you know it is your father was a Kohen, and then you become a Kohen, and it goes down the male line, like a surname would go down the line. Well, in this case, Aaron is a Kohen, but his father was just a Levi. And so this is the only example I can think of where you would have 2 different designations in one patronymic name. We have Aharon HaKohen, son of Amram HaLevi. In talking about surnames, sometimes surnames will then be generated based on physical characteristics or places or occupations. Reznik, for instance, is a butcher in Polish, and Reznicki, I have to say this very carefully, is a son of a butcher. And then that could be a name that would be handed down after generation, even though those people might not be butchers anymore. But it could give you an indication, a clue as to what your family did at the time they took that occupational name. Patronymic names, though, have been around forever. If you think about small groups of people, you didn't need family names. There weren't that many people in a very small community. And so we have patronymic names all around us that you may just take for granted. If you think about names like Adamson or Robertson, that's Adam's son or Robert's son. And think about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacobs. Abramson, Isaacson, Jacobson, make it shorter, Abrams, Isaacs, Jacobs. All of these are patronymic names. The Welsh ones I thought were kind of interesting. There was a prefix, ap, ab, or up. Over time, the A dropped off. So if you hear a name like Pritchard, Pritchard is really son of Richard. Bowen is son of Owen, and Upjohn is son of John. And if you lived in a country where they used Romance languages, it's almost like you had a choice. So if you look at Italy, you could be Di Martino, from Martino, or you could have been Antonelli, the little Anton. Patronymic names were widely used throughout the world. So in Poland, if your father's name was Abram, The son in the family would be known as Abramowitz, and the daughter in the family would be known as Abramovna. Abramovna, Ovna at the end would be an unmarried woman. Ova at the end would be a married woman. In some cases, but not in much rarer cases, there are matronymics. So if you see names like Belkin, that's a derivation from Belka, or Dvorkin, Dvorka, Malkin, Malka, and Rivkin, Rivka. And we see some examples of that on stones. So here's Rachel Edelson meaning son of Edel, or Esther's son of Esther. Some surnames could be occupational in nature. Fleischer is a butcher in German, Moliner is a miller, Schmidt Kowalski is some kind of a smith, and a Calderon is a maker of pots. There was a mini-series on a number of summers ago in which there was a family named Wheeler. They lived in a town named Wheeler, and guess what they did? They were wheelers. They made Conestoga wagon wheels. And so here you had a trifecta where you had the same source being the name of a surname, the name of a town, as well as the name of an occupation. Here are some occupations that are more specifically Jewish. Einstein is a mason, Fleischer, Fleischmann, Katzoff, and Metzger are butchers, Schneider, Kravitz, and Portnoy are tailors, and Zucker or Zuckerman is somebody in the sugar trade. Here are some examples on stones of occupational names. Glazer is a glass blower, baker and spice handler are pretty clear what they are. And then there are physical characteristics sometimes for names. Altmann literally means old man in German. So was the person who first took my surname back in Europe an older man, or maybe it was a sign of respect? Born is smaller or younger, Longfellow is a tall man, Rossi or Rossini is a ruddy complexioned or redheaded person. And there are some suffixes that could be at the end of names that might give an indication if you were near some kind of a mountain or a lake or a castle, but not that much in terms of Jewish surnames. Now, do you think anybody uses this anymore in 21st century, right, Western world? Well, believe it or not, there is one place where you still do see this. And it's because my daughters used to play travel soccer that I used to watch the women's national team every time they would play a game. And when matches were against a team that was away from the US, they would put the names of all the players and their positions on the board. And take a look here at the roster for the Icelandic women's team. This is from 2018, but it would be the same. Look at the second names here. Gunnar's daughter, Sigurd's daughter, Train's daughters, Alter's daughter, Vigur's daughter. They're all being referred to as the daughter of their father's name. If you look at the men's team, you see Halder's sons, Runar's son, Saber's son, Sigurd's son, Arna's son, same thing. The children in the family don't have a family name. They're both being referred to based on the father's first name. And this is the way it is in Iceland. Now, Iceland was a very closed community before World War II, and there were no indigenous people in Iceland. And so if you were to go back to the beginnings of the population of Iceland, which goes back, I think, to around the year 950, and they know who went there and started all the farmsteads. If you go back 4 generations, everybody's related to everybody else. And so that poses somewhat of a problem. And so when I was in Iceland and I had a chance to go there and visit it, we went from the hotel to the National Museum, and right there in the front of a cemetery that I passed, you'd think I planned it, but I didn't, was Jan Bjarni Peterson and Ingeborg Steingrim's daughter, right? So you're born with your patronymic name and you die with your patronymic name. And so this idea about everybody being related to everybody poses a little bit of a problem. I mean, how do you know if you're in your 20s or 30s or whatever, and you're dating and you want to get married and you want to know how closely related you are to somebody? Well, believe it or not, they have an app for that. The whole idea was to download those databases into the phone. And each person would take their phone and they would bump phones before they would bump, well, you get the idea, right? And the whole idea was it would tell you how closely related you are to the other person based on the databases that were built up. And they actually call this an incest app. One other kind of name I want to mention is what I call legacy names. So if you know nothing about the National Basketball Association in the United States, and I told you there was a team called the Jazz, And I said, what city do you think the jazz would be in? Most likely you would say New Orleans. Well, you might be surprised to know that the jazz plays in Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, Salt Lake City and New Orleans are probably the most contrary cities in the country. They have nothing to do with each other and have very different customs. So why is the jazz in Utah? Because they used to be in New Orleans, but they moved. And why they kept their name, I don't know, but they did. Well, we have surnames that might give an indication as to where your family came from. These are all Jewish surnames: Berliner, Brodsky, De Cordova, Prager, Warshawski, and Wiener, right? All of these could be an indication as to where your family came from prior to the time they took their surname. So everybody in Warsaw, for instance, would be a Warshawski, right? You'd all be from Warsaw. But if somebody moved from Warsaw to maybe a smaller little shtetl, and then they started taking surnames, maybe he was referred to as Warshawski, and that might be the way that he took his surname. Now, lastly, when we talk about surnames, somebody will send me their list of surnames and they'll say, how did I get this surname? Or why did I get this surname? What does it mean? And all I can do is I can tell you, in some cases, it's just because. Just because somebody wanted to change it, they could pick any kind of surname they wanted. On my maternal side, this is my maternal great-grandfather, Hyman Bialystok, and he had 4 sons, and all of them changed their names. So William became William Bialer, Charles became Charles Peeler, Samuel became Samuel Beeler, and Avraham became Joe Bailey. And of course, the one that stands out is Joe Bailey. Why did he pick a name like Joe Bailey? And the reason made sense. He wanted to be a prize fighter, and he wasn't going to step into a ring with a name like Avraham Bialystok. And he picked Joe Bailey, that he thought was a good prize fighter's name. And sure enough, there actually is a Prize Fighters Hall of Fame in upstate New York. And I was able to find some records on his boxing career. And he boxed in 2 bouts, got knocked out in both. And that was the end of the Joe Bailey story. Although I still do have lines in my family of Baileys, and they are very much Jewish. So in figuring out how to get past that brick wall, I use patronymic naming to go back in time. And the question is, where can you find these patronymic names? And one of the best places to find them is on headstones. And so taking a trip to the cemetery will yield certain information that you might not be able to find on a lot of other documents. So these are my paternal grandparents. You can see Sadie Altman is Cyril Bat Natan Nuta. So now I have her father's name. And Nathan Altman was Noach Ben Munish. Now I have his father's name. And where can you find these other than going to visit the actual cemetery? Well, JewishGen is one fantastic source for it. And we have the JOBAR, the JewishGen's online worldwide burial registry database that you can use. And if you were to go to the JewishGen site, along the top menu, you'll see a research tab. If you press on research, you'll get a drop-down menu. And from that drop-down menu, you'll see the burial registry, JOBAR. While I have the drop-down menu here, I just want to point out that you also could do a search all records, which is a universal search against all of the JewishGen databases. And it also has a memorial and plaques database, which I'll discuss at the end of the presentation a little bit. In addition to JewishGen, there are other sites online, and if you're doing searches, you should take a look at all of them. And so Find a Grave is a popular site. This is from Ancestry. It does not focus on Jewish genealogical research information, so you're not going to find patronymic names. You may find pictures on there, but these are cemeteries all throughout the world. This is part of Ancestry. Billion Graves is part of MyHeritage, works pretty much this very similar way. There are other sources of information out there if you have certain information to start with. For instance, JCAM is the Jewish Cemetery Administration in Massachusetts. Now, if you know already that you have somebody buried in a Massachusetts cemetery, in a Jewish cemetery in Massachusetts, that's great. But if you don't know where they're buried, and if you don't know whether or not it happens to be one of the JCAM cemeteries, this site might not help you. That's why JewishGen's JOBAR database is it's a worldwide index that you can do searches by name. So you may be able to do a search and find somebody and find that they are buried in a place that you never expected them to be, which makes that, it's a very important tool and a very good tool to use. So right now, as of my research, I can tell you my name is Noach ben Munish, ben Noach ben Munish, ben to be determined. And of course, as we know, is always to be determined. I'm going to give you a case example of how this can actually work out and how it can help you. This was something that was posted on a JewishGen discussion group back in 2010. And this person was looking for Adolf Wolkowski. And he already did some of the research. He got in touch with the cemetery in Queens, found out where in the cemetery Adolf Wolkowski's headstone was, and was asking if somebody in the area would be nice enough to go and take a picture of the headstone. And so I went to the cemetery, and the first thing I tell people, if there is an office in a cemetery, and even if you think you know the information, go into the office. Ask them again, make sure that you get everything that you need. But while you're there, once I got the information for Adolf, I said, is there anybody else named Wolkowski in that section where Adolf is buried? And they said, yes, there was. And so I said, all right, well, give me that information. And then I took a chance. I said, is there anybody else in the cemetery with the name Wolkowski? And they said, yes, in a different section. And I said, well, do me a favor. Let me have that information as well. And they gave me that. And so then I went out into the cemetery. And sure enough, what I found was Adolf Wolkowski, who's also known as Aaron. You can see his stone is on the left. And you notice on the top, you'll see it looks like branches that are folded over. They're kind of bent. I'll talk about that symbolism in a little bit. But there was a picture of him, which was a big bonus. And then on the bottom of the stone was his full Hebrew name, Aharon ben Chaim Leib HaLevi. Well, I went to the other stone that was in that section, and not, surprisingly, it was his wife, Esther. And we have Esther with a picture of Esther, and also her Hebrew name, Esther Bat Yitzchak. So now we know her father's name as well. I took that information, and then I drove to the other section where there were Wolkowskis. And when I went there, I saw this big family stone that said Wolkowski, Nadel, Walker, and Goldman. And keep in mind, I don't know any of these people. This is not my family. But what I decided to do was go out, walk around, and see what was on the stones that I could find. And lo and behold, this is what I found. Dorothy Goldman was Devorah Bat Aharon HaLevi. Jack Walker was Yaakov ben Aharon HaLevi. Joseph Wolkowski was Yosef ben Aharon HaLevi. And Ray Nadel was Ruchel Bat Adolf, right? The English name Adolf was transliterated into Hebrew characters. But all of these are the children of Aharon HaLevi. So what I'm looking at are siblings, and that's the connection between all these surnames. And this was really an interesting find because, first of all, there are two women here, and you know how difficult it is to find women once they get married using their maiden names. And secondly, we've got a man here, Jack Walker, who changed his name from Wolkowski to Walker. And so just by making this one visit to the cemetery, I was able to put together a 3-generational chart and send this off to the researcher. And now he had additional lines to research based on surnames. And he also had pictures of the two individuals that he first started with. So this was a fantastic find. Yeah, I have to admit, sometimes it's luck to find that kind of information, but you never know. This is what you can get when you make a cemetery visit. In terms of the symbolism on stones, you might see a candelabra on the side for a woman, or Mogan David on the side for a man. I know some of the stones in the New York area, they're works of art. You take a look when you walk around, just don't go to the stone that you're looking for, but just take a look around and see what's there. It might be interesting. You all recognize this gentleman? This is Leonard Nimoy playing Mr. Spock. He passed away a couple of years ago, but Leonard Nimoy was Jewish. And doing it in his role of Mr. Spock on Star Trek, he had a scene in the very beginning with William Shatner, who played Captain Kirk. And William Shatner is Jewish. And so the two of them had this conversation. At the end of the conversation, they said, well, what should we do to end the conversation? And Shatner said something, well, we can shake hands and go our ways. And Nimoy said, well, I'm not shaking hands with you. You're a human. I can't do that. So Shatner said, well, all right, what do you want to do? So he said, I'll give you one of these, the split hand sign. Now, Nimoy knew what he was doing because he was Jewish and he'd seen this and it was impressed to him during the high holidays when he would go during Yom Kippur and the priest would give the blessing over the congregation. And so Nimoy knew what he was doing. Shatner knew what he was doing. And they said if Gene Roddenberry, the creator of the show, had any idea what these two guys were doing, you probably never would have seen this on Star Trek. But what he's giving you is the sign of the Kohen. And when you walk around and you take a look at some of the stones in the cemetery, you will see the sign, the hands of the split hands on the sign of the Kohen. And in the Hebrew name, you should see at the end of the Hebrew name, HaKohen, like we talked about when we're talking about the patronymics. Not all Cohens are Kohens, not all Kohens are Cohens, but there is a surprisingly large number of the K sound for Kohens. And here you've got two examples, Klug and Korman. This is a very unusual one because as we mentioned, Kohens go from father to son to son to son to son. Here is a woman's marker with the sign of the Kohen. It's the only one I've ever seen like that. And again, the hard K sound, Koplan. The sign of Levi is the water pitcher used by the priest to wash their hands before giving blessings. You'll see at the end of their name, Ha-Levi. For young adults, this takes me back now to that the one I showed you with the branches on the top. Here you see an actual tree on the left that's broken up, and on the right you see a tree that looks like all its limbs have been cut off. And what this is showing that these people died in their prime. They were cut down in their prime. And so you typically see this on late teens and 20s and 30s. The one we saw before was a gentleman in his 50s, but still cut down in his prime. You also may find those markers for infants and newborns. They tend to be made of different material than the other markers are, which is unfortunate because what happens is they erode much more quickly. And so the information that might be on those stones may be much more difficult to read if you can read them at all. There are veterans markers that you can get from the VA in the United States. So here we have Alexander Glucksman. He was a private in Company G, 1st Louisiana Cavalry, CSA. That's the Confederate States of America. We've got Max Williams from the Spanish-American War, Abraham Goldfarb, World War I, and Harvey Satter, World War II. What makes these markers interesting is that they give you information about their service in the branch of the services that they were in. So if you're trying to get veterans files, this might help you. It might actually give you the unit they were in and the campaigns that they fought. This is an example for Charles Solomon. And I know JewishGen Talks had a speaker from the Benjamin Project. Charles Solomon died, was buried in the Normandy Cemetery in France under a cross. The issue is that Charles Solomon was Jewish. And so there was a rededication ceremony from the people from Operation Benjamin. And what they did was they went to the family to make sure that the family was okay with them changing the marker. And the family was, and they did this rededication. Now, why would he have been buried under a cross? Well, when you went into the service, you declared your religion. And if you didn't declare a religion, by default, you would have gotten a cross. Why wouldn't you have declared that you were Jewish? Well, if you were going into Europe, you might have been concerned about being captured as a POW in Germany or in the area by Germans and their allies, or you might have been concerned about anti-Semitism. And so there were quite a few people who did not choose to self-identify their religion when they filled out their enlistment papers. Here's an example of a veteran's marker that was also next to a private marker. And so you can get these veteran markers and you can put them in private cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries or non-denominational cemeteries. The only issue is, as you can notice, the date of birth is different. The year of birth is different between the public and the VA marker. And this just goes to show you one of the other problems with markers is that I know there are lots of times people will come to me and they'll say, I know this is the way the family name is spelled, or I know this is the right date because it's on a stone. And you have to realize that the stones, the information on stones is just as good as the information that you're giving to the stone cutter and the information that the person has that is giving it. So there are mistakes on headstones in many cases, you can't take them as the absolute truth. This is one of the more recent markers that you'll see with us within two different choices here of Holocaust survivors. And what's interesting about these is that these people are survivors, but there are people who will mark on either the back of their stone or adjacent to the stone other members of the family who may have died during the Holocaust, but clearly are not buried under a stone because they were lost in one of the camps or in transit or in mass graves. And so here are a couple examples where you can see on the left side, Ernest Herman, on the back of his is for memory of Jirka Herman, killed in Auschwitz. And then the one on the right, they put all of the names right there in the front of people who were lost during the Holocaust. And so even though these are not literally burials in cemeteries, they are memorializing these people on their stones. And our new memorials and plaques plaques database is the perfect place now to make sure that all of these names are included so they will not be lost to history. This is an incredible stone. If you take a look at this one, he gave an entire lineage of all the people that he knew of that were lost, gave women's maiden names, gave towns, gave dates, total amount of information all in this one stone. Has to be a genealogist, right? Just a little quick bit on how to read a Jewish headstone, even if you don't know how to read Hebrew. We're taking this one, Theodore Cohn, as an example. And the first thing that we notice right away is that he is a Kohen, right? We have the sign of the Kohen. So we know that he's a Kohen, and at the end of his Hebrew name, it says HaKohen. At the top of the stone, you'll typically see these two letters, the Pei and the Nun, which stands for Po Nikbar, here lies. And then what we're looking for is the Ben, or where you'll see the Beit and the Resh, bear, or Bat, right? So if we see where it says son of or daughter of, we'll know that the name immediately before that is the name of the deceased, and the name immediately after that is going to be the name of the father, right? So in our case here, we can see the Beit Resh, which actually stands for Ben Ray Rob, which is an honorific. I'll mention that in a minute. And then after that, we see Shrega Fivish. So in his first name is Tuvia, which is to the right of the bear. His full name is Tuvia ben Shrega Fivish HaKohen. In terms of the dates of death, Hebrew does not use numerals. Hebrew uses the letters in the alphabet, and each letter is a designation for a number. So Aleph is 1 as the first letter of the alphabet, Bet is 2, and you go all the way down to 10, which is Yud. And then if you want to get to the number 11, you start doing some math. You do 10 plus 1, right? 10 plus 1 would be Yud Aleph, that would be 11. 10 plus 2 is 12, Yud Bet. And all that works out really fine until you get to 15 and 16. Because if you got to 15 and 16, you get Yud He and Vav and Yud Vav. And the Tetragrammaton, the name of God, is Yud He Vav He. So we don't use those when we do numbers. So how am I going to do 15 if I can't do 10 plus 5? How about 9 plus 6? And then for 16, how about 9 plus 7? And then to do 17 and going forward, we go back to the 10 plus 7, 10 plus 8, on and on and on. In terms of months, you'll see the month typically also on the stone. The Hebrew calendar is a modified lunar calendar. Why is it modified? Because we have harvest dates, and the harvest dates actually obviously have to come out during harvest times. So we do have the months of Adar. Believe it or not, Adar is a leap month, not Adar 2. And so that will be found on the stone. And typically when you're looking at the stone, you can look for the word niftir, or you'll see this abbreviation, which means died. And after that, you'll then get the date. So here's the designation for the date, and then comes the month and the year. So we'll do this one quickly. We have here, we have 22, and then we have the month of Iyar, and then we have this is the Tav Shin He, 400 plus 300 plus 5, oops, is 705. You add the 5,000, 5705. So 705 plus 1240, this would be 1945, right? Everybody got that? All right. You might want to do one of these. You might even want to do two of these, but you're not going to do a lot of these. And so the easier way of figuring out how to do this, even if you don't know how to read Hebrew and these letters are not something that you're accustomed to, is go to Steve Morse's page. He has a page for deciphering Hebrew tombstone dates in one step with a drop-down menu, makes it very simple. And all you have to do is match the letters to his drop-down menu, and it'll come up with the secular date. Now, keep in mind, he didn't have this originally, but he does have this now. You see the asterisk. Keep in mind that the Hebrew day starts at sundown. And so every Hebrew day crosses over two secular days. And unless you have, unless you know that a person died after sundown or before sundown, you wouldn't know exactly which Hebrew day it was. There are stones that actually say AM or PM, or will say during the day or at night. And so that will give an indication as to which one would be the appropriate date. And then on most stones, you're going to see these abbreviations, which basically is for the phrase, may his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. And unfortunately, the one that I've been using as an example, this one, the fourth letter is wrong. And it wasn't until a researcher actually wrote me that I took a look at it and realized it really should have been a bait at the end for the fourth symbol, not another nun. So genealogists are fantastic, and I learn more every time I do one of these. All right, the rest of what I want to show you is some observations and some tips that I've come across in doing cemetery research. So sometimes someone will send me a note going, I found my, my grandfather's grave and he was a rabbi. I had no idea he was a rabbi. And I'll go, oh, all right, that's kind of interesting. And then he says, you're not going to believe this, but everybody in the section was a rabbi. I'll go, well, what makes you think that's the case? That doesn't sound right. He goes, yeah. There was a resh in front of his name for rabbi, and it's not. So here's when you get that date R, resh, and it's Ben Rab. Rab meaning Mr. It's an honorific. So on the right side, you see Louis Jacob, and you see the bait and the resh for Fievel. So it's Mr. Fievel. Whereas on the left side, Rose, you see Bat with the resh, Tzvi, Mr. Tzvi. And so these are not rabbis. The resh does not mean rabbi. If it was a rabbi, though, you would see it. It would say Harav, just like we said HaLevi and HaKohen. This would be the rabbi, Harav, with the name after that. And so that designation would be on the stone. In some cases, you might get lucky enough to see a woman's maiden name. Something to think about when you're looking at stones and creating stones. Another important find, if you're going to visit a cemetery, might be that you'll find alternative spellings for surnames. Now, Shevet with an E and Shevet with an I is pretty close, but maybe you never thought about Shevet being spelled with a CH. And so whenever you visit the cemetery, you really should walk around and see what other names are around there. Something might ring a bell. These four stones were all in the very same section of the cemetery when I was walking around. Oblingenhart and Obligen on the top two. You can't tell me these two aren't related somehow. I don't know how, it's not my family, but I would certainly want to take a look at that. And these two on the bottom, Obladzinski and Oblo. I would think that these two are somehow related. It's possible that all four of these are somehow related. They were all in the same section. So that's the kind of thing that you might find when you're walking around a cemetery. In some cases, you might actually get the individual's original name. We know people changed their name after they came to the country. No, not at Ellis Island, but afterwards. So here we see Buddy Hoff was originally Solomon Hoffman, or Jack Ross was originally Jacob Rothkopf. Really good finds. Here's a tip that I will give you that may or may not work for you. I noticed that in some sections, you will find that the stone, the style of the stone could be the same for family members, even though family members are not necessarily buried together. So on the left, you have the Wassermans, Samuel and Minnie, and on the right, you have the Greensteins, but they're in the same section, but they're not together. And so maybe it's possible that Anna Greenstein was born a Wasserman, or Minnie Wasserman was born a Greenstein. It's something else to take a look at, and just another clue that you might find as you're walking around. This one was done very appropriately for genealogists. This is Bernice Rocker Block and Frederick Block. They both were married twice. But what they were nice enough to do was they were nice enough to give not only their current spouses, but their previous spouses, and then tell you who they had their children with. So on the left side, you see Bernice Rocker Block, mother of Anita and Nancy Stapin, because she was the wife of Manuel Stapin originally. And then Frederick Block had two children, Elizabeth and Fred Block, and he was the husband of Jean Libman originally. You'll also see non-religious symbols. I think these are wonderful because it gives you more of an idea about the person. So you have Stephen Straminski, you've got the carpenter tools on the left and a guitar on the right. Maybe he was a carpenter, maybe he was just good with his hands and craft work. The guitar, I originally always thought that he was a guitar player, but because his name was Straminski, maybe that was just his nickname, Strum. And maybe that's why it's there. But you've got Robert Ox, who might be into sailing. Here's Carmel Bernstein on the bottom, artist, quilter, and photographer, lover of books and readers. It tells you something about that person. You feel like you know something about them more than just a name. Here's one from Israel. She was a master Scrabble player. And you may have some problems in some cemeteries where they have more strict codes as to what you can put on a marker and what you can't. There are some that if you go into, you'll find that all the styles are exactly the same, or all the markers are flat surface markers instead of monuments. But in some cases, there's total flexibility as to what you can do. Sometimes you'll find out something you didn't know about a person. Here's Cheryl Reber, mother, daughter, sister, friend, and Democrat. This one I was putting together and it said sheer, and I see on the bottom right, it says a woman's place is in the house. And I was thinking, well, you know, this is not something you probably would want to say anymore, except why is her place in the house? Because she was a member of the Missouri legislature. So a woman's place is in the house. This was a Canadian stone that was sent to me, a Bennett Allen Mazel. I don't know if you recognize the plant growing there on the left, but on the back of his stone, it says, we don't need no stinking permit, and how appropriate that it looks like they just mowed the grass. And you see a little bit of the grass underneath that. And just another example of why you need to be nice to the people who are going to make your stone. Here's Edward Thompson. He was a pioneer, a publican, and a snob. This one I thought was really a joke. Goldilocks first, right? And so I actually went into Ancestry to see, was there really somebody named Goldilocks? And yeah, Goldie Flora Locks. Now, it's not Goldie's fault. Her name is Goldilocks. It's her parents. I don't know why people do that, but she had to live with this for her whole life. Here's an example of something I was using for years. Somebody sent me this one. They said, I have no idea what this is, do you? And the answer I gave them was no, I really don't. It's not an eternal flame. It looks like there might just be some water at the top. But it says here, what did this cost? So the best we could come up with was every place he went, he would always say, what does this cost? What does this cost? What does this cost? And maybe that's why they put it on his marker. Well, I was giving this presentation a couple of years ago, and somebody wrote to me and they said that they were, believe it or not, they were a performer in the circus and an artistic type. And they said they knew what this was. And I said, well, what is it? They said, it's a Hebrew star. And sure enough, I went online and I found out that this individual was the owner of a museum of Jewish art. And if you were to look at it straight on from the front, you would see the Hebrew star. And because of that, I'm happy to give Rachel Stegman credit for answering this question that had plagued us all for years and years and years. Here's a marker from Romania, which is done in wood. Believe it or not, this is from 1926 and has stood the test of time way better than a lot of regular monuments have. These two were found on Long Island. You'll notice the hammer and sickle. These are from the International Workers' Organization. Both these individuals died in their 30s. They also died in the 30s. I don't know if this had to do with the Spanish Civil War or not, but I thought it was kind of interesting. Take a look at the one on the right. It says beloved husband and comrade. Starting in the 1970s, I started to see the Hebrew names expressed this way. This is Hannah bat Feivel ve Devorah. In other words, and the mother's name. And in the 70s was the women's movement. And I started to see more and more Hebrew names expressed with the mother and the father's name on the stone, which I personally think happens to be a nice way to do it. Unfortunately, I'm also seeing more and more stones like this where there's no Hebrew on it. And it's mostly because people just didn't know what to put on it. I'm also seeing a lot more stones like this, where if you look on the left side, you'll see the wife's name was Pearl. There's a date of birth there, but there's no date of death. And considering she was born in 1907, there's a good chance that Pearl is probably not with us anymore. But chances are she moved. She could have retired and moved to some other place. She could have remarried, and she might be buried under a completely different name somewhere. But what we're left with is this legacy stone that does have her Hebrew patronymic name on it. And that's an important piece of information for anybody who's trying to do research into that family. We know about transliterating names from the Hebrew to the English. So if we take a look at Samuel Franks on the left, this is an Australian stone. Samuel's name is Shmuel ben Yaakov, a very nice Hebrew name, Shmuel ben Yaakov. The name on the right, Jacqueline Elizabeth Franks, her Hebrew name that's expressed above her name there. You know what that one says? It says Jacqueline Elizabeth Franks. Now, my guess is that it's a mixed marriage, and that was just transliterated basically from English into Hebrew characters, but I don't know for sure. The point being here, you can't tell who's Hebrew by their name. Here's Barney O'Hara, and he's got his Hebrew name on there, Dov Beryl ben Avraham. This was probably a conversion. Dov Beryl is the name that he took, but son of Abraham, meaning son of the Jewish people, as opposed to his father, his actual father being Abraham. And this was found when I was doing a project with students up at the University of Albany. And I asked them to go around and they indexed 2 entire cemeteries of Albany, along with some memorial plaques and synagogues. And I asked them to take some pictures while they were doing it. And this one was totally by chance. And if you take a look behind the student, you'll see there's a stone for O'Leary. Again, a Jewish stone for O'Leary. And I think the most satisfying part that came out of this was when we asked the students to write a couple of sentences about what did they get out of this. They wrote things like, I wasn't standing in front of a stone, I was standing in front of a life. The work I did here is something that will last forever. I was able to help people with their research and their family history. And this was the best project I ever did at school. And that is perfect for what it is that we try to do to get younger generations interested in genealogical research. This one I thought was interesting, Solinsky. If you look on the left side, Sam S. Solinsky, all his S's are dollar signs. And I thought that was a little crass. But if you look on the right, Isabel Solinsky, her S's aren't dollar signs. Why? Did she spend it all? I don't know. There's a custom that you put stones on top of a headstone to show that you've visited. This one is a little overdone, but on Long Island in one of the cemeteries, I found that instead of using stones, they use shells, little local flavor to show that you visited. Here's one for Doris Seward. She was an optimist, didn't quite make the year 2000. Sophie got better, but she never did. Mistakes on stones. I mentioned to you, you could have mistakes on stones. To redo a stone was very expensive. And so you may see names actually just painted over, right? This was something like Ellen underneath, and now it's Annie on top of that. These are my maternal grandparents again. Remember I mentioned to you the Bialystocks? On the left side is Hyman, on the right side is Rosie, his wife. They're in the same cemetery, in the same section, in the same row, but they're not next to each other. But you can look at the style of the stone. They're the same style stone, right? You see the Mogan David on top of his, and you see the candelabra on top of hers. But what makes this so unusual? their last name is spelled differently on the two stones. You would have thought that somebody would have recognized the fact that they spelled the name wrong. Now, this is kind of unusual, I think, but then all of you out there, you might have all been helping in a database. Maybe, you get to a name like Friedman. How do you spell Friedman? Is it F-R-I-E? Is it F-R-E-I? I don't know. But on a joint stone, don't you think they should be spelled the same way on the same stone? Here's an example of a stone that looks like it was taken from a drone. And I wrote back to the person, I said, you sent me all these other really nice pictures, and this one you sent from the top, and I can barely read the Hebrew. What's the story? And they said, well, believe it or not, it's facing the wrong way. It's facing the row behind it. And we're trying to figure out why on earth would a stone be facing the wrong way? Because if they started the row and then they changed which way they were going to look, they could have turned the stone. And so we don't know why it's facing the wrong way. Maybe they didn't pay for it. I don't know. But it's just another unusual sighting in a cemetery. Do mistakes happen only to unknown people? The answer is no. Ed Koch, who was mayor of New York City for a long time, very well known, was a veteran of World War II. He picked out the cemetery he wanted to be buried in. He picked out his stone. He picked out what he wanted on his headstone. They had an entire ceremony for him, and this was the stone that they placed over his grave. And if you notice his date of birth, it says December 12th, 1942. But I told you, he was a veteran of World War II. They transposed the numbers. His date of birth should have been 1924. And yet again, a famous person like this, and still a mistake. This is just a genealogical no-no, right? This is dates and months with a single digit. You have to find out what cemetery it's in and know what the custom is to know whether or not that's a date and a month or a month and a date. On some of the European stones, you'll find verses from Psalms or from the Torah, and you'll see acrostics, right? So here the person's name is Yitzchak Meyer, and if you take a look going down, every line that starts with a letter in his name. So here's Yitzchak and Meyer. This one is in Radom, Poland. Here's an unusual one. Can you tell where the mistake is? Well, it seems like Christiana wasn't buried in a leap year. It must have been a super leap year, February 31st, right? And then I read later on that sometimes they used February 31st when they didn't know the exact date. I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense. It seems to me it would have been just as easy to put down 1869 instead of a date that never existed. Here's a stone there where the inscription says that this person was buried in Mount Gomorrah. And I'm building the database and I'm looking at it, Mount Gomorrah, and I'm thinking, who would live in a place called Mount Gomorrah? In fact, who would even name a town Mount Gomorrah, right? But if you keep reading, Mount Gomorrah is in the state Alabama in America. That's not Mount Gomorrah, that's Montgomery, Alabama. And again, someone will say, nope, I saw it on a stone. That's where they were buried. Here's Mel Blanc's. That's all, folks. Sometimes you can get very flexible on the stones and what you can put on a stone. This one is from Israel. I just wonder, there were a lot of technical people in Israel that were involved in the creation of the cell phone, or it's possible he was just crossing the street looking at his phone and got hit by a bus. We'll never know. This one I just don't understand. There's a phone number on the stone. That's a long distance call. And then there's the BP Roberts one. I told you I was sick. Now this one, I'm pretty sure was photoshopped, right? However, this one wasn't. These are the kaputs. And the reason why we're going through all of this is basically shown in this one slide, because the photo on the left was taken in 2006 when a researcher went back to his ancestral home, took pictures of all the stones that were in the cemetery, and we were able to get information from those stones. When he went back in 2013, the stone had disintegrated to the point where we would have lost a lot of that information. And it wasn't from destruction, it wasn't, vandalism, it was just natural wear and tear. And so this is what we're trying to do. By keeping that stone on the left, we now have a permanent digital cemetery, basically, in our database, there to help researchers for future generations forever. It's a race to be able to get this information into the database before the information disappears. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention the other database, which is JewishGen's Memorials and Plaques database. It used to be just memorial plaques, the ones that you would see in the synagogue, but we've expanded that because there were certain memorials that listed people's names, like the Holocaust victims that we saw, but they exist in a lot of other places. There were memorials in cemeteries, there were memorials in synagogues, the memorials that are just in front of buildings that list names of people. And so we've expanded this to be a memorials and plaques database. And so here you see just an example of some of them. On the left is some examples of those who were lost during the Holocaust. There are lists of people who were deported from certain towns. There are veterans from World Wars I and World War II, all different kind of plaques, including people who started synagogues, founders, officers, and all of those are perfect for this new database that we have. So if you've got memorial plaques and memorials for people, even if it is little light on information, if it just has names, it still might be of interest to a researcher to be able to find a relative of theirs on one of those plaques. And that database works exactly like the Jobard database works. So you can do a unified search, you can go to the actual database and do the search there and find the names. And just to run through this, again, here's, for example, here's Chaim Goldenblatt. Here is Devorah Bela Goldenblatt. And here is Anne, which is Elka Chana Bat Chaim Halevi Vi Devorah Bela. And so again, the patronymic names will come through. And that is my presentation. So we challenge you to help us in terms of building up Jobar, continuing to build up Jobar. I happen to have seen a couple of the names of the attendees on here, and I know that there are quite a number of volunteers. The databases could not exist without the efforts of our volunteers. So whether they're volunteers who go out and shoot pictures of the headstones, transliterate headstones, do the data entry, match up names, all of them are valued volunteers, and we appreciate all of their help and all of their work. And so I will now attempt to answer some of the questions in the Q&A. As far as my contact, you can send me emails at n.altman@JewishGen.org. You can find my email address all over the JewishGen site. One question has something about whether or not there would be a surname if the surname wasn't known. There probably would not be one if the surname wasn't known, but I should also tell you that in many of the European headstones, all you'll find is the Hebrew patronymic name, and many times, or most times, those exclude the surname, the secular surname. So all you'll find will be the Hebrew name on there. I don't know anything more about the surname Gesundheit, other than maybe he sneezed when somebody asked him what his surname was. Any advice for learning where someone is buried when you can't find death records in the usual places? Well, like I said, you can do a search on JewishGen. You could do a search on Find a Grave and Billion Graves. It looks like you may have tried that already. The death records, obviously the death record is going to be filled out where the person died. So it is possible that, a person died in a place other than where they were buried. But I don't have any other ideas for you off the top. This person says his great uncle's Mitzvah has different parents than his grandfather. If the parents are unknown, was Abraham and Sarah used as a default? I have seen Abraham used like we did see in the conversion. I don't know if Sarah would have been on there. It would have been a little unusual to even have the mother's name. So if they didn't know the mother's name, it probably would have been left off. Does the burial registry show listings by the Hebrew on the headstone, or also possible Yiddish names? The names that are on the headstones, halachically, probably should be the Hebrew, but that doesn't mean that that's always the case. You can find Yiddish names. You can find nicknames, Yiddish nicknames on a stone as well. So whatever is on the stone is what we would put into the database. We don't make any kinds of assumptions as to what the name might have been. We don't make corrections to what looks like an obvious typo. We may put that in the comments section, but the information that we have in the database comes directly from the source documents that we get. There are some questions here about specific surnames, and I don't, without looking them up, I don't know most of these. Same thing with some of these occupational names. A lot of these are very specific, so that's why I'm passing through these. One of the questions here is, does anyone know any reason why many stones at Washington Cemetery in Brooklyn were photographed, but not all? The information that we have in most cases comes from individuals who go out, photograph, and index sections. In some cases, we get the cemetery's assistance and they'll send us information. But the larger cemeteries, especially in the New York metropolitan area, in the Chicago metropolitan area, in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, we don't have the benefit of getting all of their information. So the photos that you will find online are those that were taken by somebody who literally went to that section and walked up and down the line and took the photos. That's why some of them will be in the database and some of them will not be. Information on other countries specifically, someone was asking something about Germany. I would also refer you to JewishGen's German research division. They might be able to help you in terms of finding other kinds of records and cemetery records. Looking for records in pre-war Poland that may have been destroyed during World War II. In some cases, obviously we don't have information on headstones. I went to some ancestral towns myself, and there are fields, but there are very little in terms of stones themselves. What you really hope to do is you hope to get lucky by finding a death record, even though there's no cemetery record of them being there. In some cases, we do have Hebra Kadisha registers, which are the registers of all the burials that were made in a cemetery. And we'll use that information to populate a spreadsheet in order to put them into the database, even though there are no headstones anymore. So there could be research done. Somebody could write a book on a town, which will use that information. It could be the Hebra Kadisha registers that are still available. Other than that, if the cemetery was destroyed during World War II, there's probably nothing else left. Yeah, I mean, someone is bringing up the possibility of having problems with patronymic names when you get names like Yaakov ben Avram and Avram ben Yaakov and on and on and on. It gets difficult. I mean, I don't know an easier way around that. You sometimes hope that you have a couple of unique names in your family, so you can see that a name is more likely than not part of your family. But yes, dealing only with patronymic names can be a problem. All right, Avrami, I kind of went through, many of these. I know there are a lot more here, but I don't know how much more time you want to spend on this. And a lot of the questions that are more specific in nature, I would suggest maybe we could deal with those separately.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Nolan. First of all, thank you to everyone from around the world who has joined us today. And I must apologize, although you have made it on, our registration closed out at 1,000. And we heard from many people who couldn't register today. So it's something that clearly a very interesting topic. The speaker was a big draw, and we will have to figure that out for the future. So if there's anyone that you know who mentions that they couldn't log in, please let them know that we are going to address that, and that we apologize for it. And really also thank you to the volunteers that Nolan mentioned. This all happens because of you, and Nolan is a volunteer. It's the volunteers who fuel everything that we do. And I hope that you will all on this call consider joining Jewish Gen as a volunteer. You will be surprised. There are many, many opportunities for you to get involved. And I thank Nolan and all the volunteers who dedicate so much time and effort to helping us all connect with our family. And finally, I'd like to thank Nolan specifically for this very informative presentation. He is the only person that I know who can make cemetery research a fun and lively experience. I'm sure he's heard that one many times before, but we really appreciate his time here today. A couple of announcements, or two announcements. For those who are in the tri-state area here in New York, I'd like to invite you to a genealogy festival that the museum is putting together on May 21st. That's Sunday, May 21st, just in a few weeks from now. There'll be an opportunity to learn about genealogy and immigration. There'll be genealogy related programs, and it would be wonderful for you to attend. It's free registration. Most of our research directors will be on hand to share information about the geographical and topical areas that they manage. Nolan will be here. It will be really an opportunity to be together and to interact with some of the leading experts in the field. And if you do come, I hope you will please find me. Make sure you say hello. It will be nice to meet you in person. You can register by visiting the museum's website. That's mjhnyc.org. So in other words, MJH, Museum Jewish Heritage, NYC.org. And then there's a link for what's called Mishpacha Fest. If it's hard to find, I'm going to send out a link in a discussion group posting and an email later today. So if you missed that, don't worry, we'll send out an email and you will be able to find it as well. The final announcement is that next week's webinar, also taking place on Wednesday at 2 o'clock here in New York, that will be given by Lee Dworkin, who is the chairman of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain. He will be talking about the Berkowitzes of East Warsaw, using US genealogy to break through Polish brick walls. So also a very interesting and informative presentation, I'm sure. I invite all of you to attend, and of course, spread the word to your friends and family that they can join us as well. So again, thank you, Nolan. Thank you all for joining us, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of the week, and hope to see you next Wednesday. Take care.